In this part, we deal with variable parameters and in-out parameters. Now, generally, when parameters are passed to functions, they are passed as constants and cannot be modified. If you want to modify them within the function, you have to declare them as var in the parameter list. And even if you do modify them in your function, they won't affect the caller variable. If you want them to affect the caller variable, then you'll have to declare them as in-out parameters. Let's take an example to illustrate what we mean by variable parameters and in-out parameters. Here, in this first example, I'm defining a function called addition, which takes two parameters, num1, which is an integer, and num2, which is an integer. All this function does is it takes the value of num1, adds it to num2, and puts that in a variable called sum. It then returns the sum. Don't worry about the statement in green, that's just been commented out. I'll use that a bit later. So at this stage, it's not part of the function. It's just commented out. So this function adds two numbers and returns the sum, which is also an integer. So once the function is defined, let's use the function and let's call the function. So I'm out of my function now. I'm on the outside. I declare two variables, one called numa, and I put in the value of 10. I declare another variable called num_b and put in the value of 20. Then I call the function called addition, which takes the number numa and passes it to num1, and takes the value of num_b and passes it to num2. Now when numa is passed to num1, a copy of numa, which is 10, is made and placed into num1. So there's two copies for 10, one sitting in numa and one sitting in num1. Whatever changes happen in num1 will not affect the changes in numa, because when the variable is copied, that num1 is now a constant. Same with num_b, which is 20. When I pass it across, a copy is made and placed into num2, and num2 also contains 20. So there's two copies of the number 10 and two copies of the number 20. I add up these two numbers, get the sum, and then return the value, which is 30. Yeah, 10 plus 20, which is 30. Now I said to you, by default, when you pass parameters to a function, they're passed as constants. Now what do I mean by that? Let me try and modify num2. Right? So I'm taking num2, which is this one, which is 20, and I'm trying to add 1 to it to make it 21. And you'll notice it says an error comes up. It says that cannot assign to let value num2. So by default, when num_b was passed on to num2, num2 was by default made a constant. So I cannot modify num2, neither can I modify num1 within this function, because these parameters are constants. If I do want to modify these parameters, num2 or num1, in this case I would like to modify num2, I put in a var before num2, and that will get rid of the error now. Now I can modify the value of num2, which was a constant, it is now a variable, and you'll see the value of 21 here, 20 plus 1. I've incremented num2 by 1. But you'll notice that num_b has not been affected. Okay, so when I passed num_b across to num2, I made a copy of it, and then I tried to modify num2 and make it 21, but that did not affect the original variable that called it, or the calling statement. So num_b remains the same of 20. It has not increased to 21. If you would like to modify a variable within the function and have it affect the caller variable, then we need to do some modification to the program. And in the next example, I'll show you how, if I modify the variable in the function, it also affects the corresponding variable from the caller. Let's take another example. Okay. So I'm declaring a function called add with two variables, num1 and num2. I'll come back to the in-out keyword in a minute. So I'm declaring a variable called num1 and num2. All it does is it accepts two parameters, adds the two numbers up, and returns the sum. Okay. So once the function has been defined, let's try and use the function. I then declare two other variables, num_c, which is 10, and num_d, which is 20, and then I call this function num_c, and I pass the parameter num_c to num1. So when I pass num_c to num1, a copy of num_c is placed into num1, and I will not be able to modify num1 in this program because it's not been declared as a variable. It's been declared by default as a constant. Now, I would like to modify, and here I'm passing num_d into num2. Don't worry about the symbol for now. I'm passing num_d into num2. A copy of num_d, which is 20, is passed into num2. Now, if I'd like to modify num2 within this program, another way to, since this is a constant, if I'd like to make it a variable, another way to make it a variable is to put in the keyword called in_out in here. Okay. And put in the ampersand sign onto num_d. What that does is, when num_d is passed on to num2, I can modify num2, like here, num2 is equal to num2 plus 1. I can increment it and get the new value of 21. And that new value of 21 will update num_d. And you'll see that num_d is now 21. So any changes that happen in the function to a variable will be updated to the caller that called it. Yep. Unlike in this example, I made a change to num2, but it didn't affect num_b. Num_b still remains 20. But in the second example, I make a change to num2 by putting in_out in here, and that affects the corresponding caller variable because I put the ampersand sign here, and you'll notice that num_d has been changed to 21. Let's try and increase it by 3. Notice it has changed here, and it has also changed down here. num_d has changed. So any changes that happen in the function will affect the caller variable. But in here, in the original example, first example, any changes that happen in the function only affects the function, but it does not affect the caller variable here.